Okay, hello. So in this video I tried to explain how well my theory on the HIV/AIDS spread fulfills Bradford Hill's criteria for a causal association. These are very well established, famous criteria that help one decide whether an association or a correlation in science may be a causal association. There is no secure test for causality in science. Even the concept of a cause cannot or is quite hard to define philosophically. Mackey proposed a quite good definition, which I also use in my philosophy of science work, but the Bradford Hill criteria are very good hints when you wish to decide whether an association in science is a causal association. Causality is very important in medicine. This is what Bradford Hill also says in his original paper. The thing about causality is quite important in medicine because as soon as you have a cause, you also have the ability for action. There is the possibility to prevent the cause and so also to prevent the effect. Now, first of all, I have discovered a difference in the sexual high-risk groups for HIV that they all have. Blacks, that is, people in Sub-Saharan Africa, and African Americans, and men who have sex with men everywhere, they belong to or they form the high-risk groups for HIV. It also occurs in other ethnic groups, in other populations, but it's rather rare there. So if we try to look for the cause, it is the most sensible thing to look at the high-risk groups. That's going to give us a hint what the cause of the spread is. And so in all these high-risk groups, all of them, there is a very specific factor. About a third of them have some kind of anogenital narrowness, tightness, stenosis, and this occurs quite often in all these high-risk groups. About a third is quite often. So that's not some kind of peanuts factor, like some genetic mutation that protects against HIV, the CCR5 receptor mutation. If you have both genes, both copies of the gene, if you are homozygous for the CCR5 receptor mutation, the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, then that receptor is broken, is not working, but HIV relies on that receptor also to enter CD4 positive cells, and so this protects, but it's way too rare. It's that factor is way too rare in Caucasians. Those who have it do have some protection, but absolute protection only occurs when they have both copies of the gene, and that is a luck of 1 in 100. About 1 in 100, 1 to 2 in 100 have that protection. So this cannot explain the difference between ethnicity here, or a minimal difference in promiscuity. There may be minimal differences in promiscuity in Sub-Saharan Africa. We almost know by now that the total numbers of sexual partners are not too different. The number of concurrent relationships might be minimally more frequent or might be more frequent, but still, when you look at the numbers of how many partners more per 12 months, on average, someone from Sub-Saharan Africa has, it's too little a difference, it's too small a difference to play a large role or to have a considerable effect. And this is what you also find in those articles. They do say, sometimes even in the Lancet, this possibly a bit racist prejudice that, well, blacks are way more promiscuous. But even then, serious scientists do admit that this factor is not, cannot explain, this factor alone cannot explain all that, cannot explain this Sub-Saharan epidemic. Might be a contributing factor, but in the biomedical field, the general view is that this is not the cause, that this has no causal role. And also, this factor, the anogenital narrowness, is quite specific. This is another Bradford Hill criterion. It is quite specific for the high-risk groups. It occurs in the high-risk groups to a very high extent, to a very high fraction, and it also occurs almost exclusively in these high-risk groups, in other populations. That factor, anogenital narrowness, is quite rare. Or there might be anal narrowness in others, but these groups don't use the anus for copulation, so much at least, as do men who have sex with men. The vaginal narrowness is probably confined, or almost confined, or at least much more frequent in black women. It's exclusively in that ethnic group to such a high extent. But the anal narrowness is almost ubiquitous. So I also do something for the generality, for all people, because it won't lead to a spread of HIV, but normal people. Normal people, WASPs, white, heterosexual, Anglo-Saxon, Protestants and so on, they also have trouble with their anus due to the mere process of defecation. I'm not only, sometimes I flatter myself as an angry leftist that I don't do anything for the white heterosexual male in my medical work here, but even this is not true. I don't even have to rape the concept of health or of a healthy anus. I don't have to say, well, a healthy anus is an anus that tolerates without any pain or trauma penile penetration, because people who have trouble with penile penetration, with receptive penile penetration of the anus, they also very frequently, or at least sometimes, have trouble during mere defecation. It's the same physiological requirements for the anus. I'd even say that constipation is often not the real problem. It's not that the stool is too thick, unless the motility or the movement of the gut is really disturbed. Unless that is really disturbed, the problem with constipation, I think, is not really that the feces are hard and thick, but the problem with constipation is just that the anus is too tight in many people. And so I even do something for the generality. It took a long time for us. Brushing your teeth goes back to very old ages, to very old and prehistoric times even. But I think to the extent that we have it today, and the almost the perfection that we have today in brushing our teeth, in that way, toothbrushing is rather new. So it took a long time for us to start toothbrushing with quite well developed brushes and with good toothpastes, or with fancy electrical toothpastes and so on. And I think now it is time to also start to take care for the other end of the digestive tract, because very many people have trouble there. About the healthy anus is something that at most 2/3 of people have. And the other third can also have a golden anus of the gods if they take care of it properly. I think dilating the anus could be a good thing for all people, at least those who have some trouble with it. Now, again, I'm not a doctor, or I'm certainly not talking to you as a doctor, even when I should be one in the future. There are also some risks. It might also, in different people, in a specific situation, it might also be harmful. There are some side effects. Some urinary retention can occur that resolves by itself. There could be infections in the tears that result from dilation. There could be an abscess, fistula formation, anal thrombosis, that blood is trapped within some venous structure there due to the dilation. That's also quite painful when that occurs, an anal thrombosis or a perianal thrombosis. All these things could occur, but I think in principle, not as a recommendation now, don't sue me, I think in principle dilating the anus is good for all people, not only for men who have sex with men. So, where was I? So this is a very specific factor for the high-risk groups, this anogenital narrowness that plays a role in sex. And all the other factors that are discussed for the epidemic, all this hodgepodge of factors, is not really specific. You know, this hodgepodge in MSM, it's promiscuity, they take drugs, it's the rectal mucosa that's supposed to be so much more sensitive than the vaginal mucosa. It's a higher number of other STIs that leads to this high number of HIV infections. But in blacks, it's a totally different hodgepodge. It's poverty, sexual violence, sex work, imprisonment, STIs, poor healthcare, migration and migratory labor. Apart from the STIs, well, yes, and I think only apart from the STIs, yes, that's the only factor that both risk groups share, and that might also, or should also, make people think. That's the only factor that they share here. Well, promiscuity. Some people say that that blacks, but still, but this is not a relevant factor in blacks, because it's just a minimal difference, and also this minimal difference, given heterosexual white transmission rates, this minimal difference cannot explain an epidemic. Promiscuity and STIs are maybe the only common factors, but otherwise the hodgepodges are totally different for the same disease, in the same prevalence, in about the same prevalence, without much use of condoms. And condoms, I repeat, I said that in many comments, that I forget the condoms, but I do not forget the condoms. Condoms do protect, but 30 years now have shown that condoms cannot end the epidemic. People are people, and people sometimes don't use condoms in all populations, in all sexual groups. But still, blacks and gays are the ones that are harmed by that virus, and the others, much more rarely do they catch it. But the main point was the specificity. It's not specific. Even this hodgepodge as a whole is not specific for Sub-Saharan Africa. Poverty, sexual violence, sex work, gender inequality. Same constellations in India. The rape statistics in Kenya, I think, were lower than in many European countries. Much lower number of reported rapes in Kenya. So this hodgepodge that is usually discussed as contributing to the HIV epidemic, this hodgepodge can almost be likened to the nonsense that is put forward by AIDS denialists. They say they have this ridiculous theory that HIV does not exist, and that AIDS is in gays an allergy to sperm, or a reaction or an effect of sex drugs. This is the cause, the AIDS denialists say, or this is what's going on in gays. In hemophiliacs, who also caught HIV from the coagulation factor medicine, what do the AIDS denialists say? It's the coagulation factor that gives them AIDS. And what gives blacks AIDS? Poor nutrition. The poverty gives them AIDS. So very different things for the same phenomenon, for the same natural phenomenon. It's the same ridiculousness. Things that are hardly specific for the groups that are affected by this disease are used to explain this epidemic. This is highly unscientific as a method, or as a process of the formation of hypotheses, of scientific hypotheses. The only difference between the AIDS denialists and the current mainstream discussions for the spread of HIV, the only difference is that the mainstream discussion has the assumption that there is HIV, but otherwise it's totally unscientific. Ockham, William of Ockham, to whom the Ockham's razor principle goes back, would get fits of crying in his grave if he knew what a multitude of hypotheses is assumed here without necessity. Highly unspecific, except for, well, one factor that points to the real cause, or that could point to the real cause, is the STIs, because the STIs are not really explained in blacks. Nobody really knows what contributes to this disproportionately higher number of STIs in blacks. But within my theory that can also be explained, and it also explains the higher number of STIs in gays. Look at the things that are specific for the high risk groups in the area of HIV, and then we're going to find the cause, or I have actually found it. Now, there is also another criterion that Bradford Hill mentions, and that is the same picture, or the same result through time and space. that people get to the same conclusions or find the same findings across countries, across different countries, and also through time or over time. And here, the studies on anodyspareunia. See my summary video. I don't know if I have the time and energy to give the individual sources here again. The studies on anodyspareunia, pain, trouble during anal intercourse. The studies on anodyspareunia, on the frequency of bleeding during sex, both in MSM and in Sub-Saharan Africa, in South Africa. The study was from South Africa. Yeah, it should be good to say that. Studies on anodyspareunia, one study in Belgium, 3 other studies in the US. Then there's studies about bleeding during sex in Sub-Saharan Africa. There was one in South Africa, and bleeding during sex in MSM. There were studies in the USA. Studies on the anal and vaginal calibers. There was a study on the anal caliber in Korea, North Korea, I think, by Cho, and there was a vaginal caliber study where the caliber of the introitus was measured in the US, in Arkansas. Then the infection dynamics in Kenyan prostitutes, in Kenyan sex workers, that also support my hypothesis. So that's Kenya, Sub-Saharan Africa, but now Kenya. Then there were studies on elevated high risk through the use of poppers and lubricant gels during sex. Where were these from? The US, I think. Yeah, both the US. And both the use of poppers and the use of lubricants, they only indicate, in my view, or they sometimes or quite often indicate relative anal stenosis. They are a hint for that narrowness. There is a common cause for both the use of poppers and higher infection rates for HIV, just as there is a common cause for the use of lubricants and the higher infection rates for HIV, and that is the anal narrowness. That leads to painful intercourse, and so you think poppers and more lubricant or consistent use of lubricant will alleviate that. But this is an illusion, because poppers and both poppers and lubricant gels only reduce the friction with which the penis passes the anal mucosa, the anal ring. They reduce the friction because the sphincter opens, or because that gel reduces the friction on the surface. But neither of the two can create more dermal circumference, more skin or more mucosal circumference of the anus. They don't increase the anal caliber, the caliber of the anal opening. They can't increase that. The only thing that those two agents can do is decrease or reduce the friction, but they cannot increase the anal caliber, which leads to tearing and pain and trauma. And all these studies are from different decades, they are from different continents, as I said, and they all point at the same finding, at the same natural phenomenon, the anogenital narrowness in the high risk groups, and they also hint that this might play a role in the HIV epidemic. Now, another Bradford Hill criterion is that there should be some biological plausibility, some mechanism between a factor, my factor would be anogenital narrowness here, and a phenomenon, HIV infection, HIV pandemic. Well, there is a biological mechanism, of course, a very plausible mechanism, and that is that there are lacerations or fissures, traumas, abrasions more frequently or deeper or more numerous, that there are more of them in the high-risk groups due to that narrowness. It's physically quite plausible. If the opening is narrower, much narrower, significantly narrower, then lacerations, abrasions, microtraumas, fissures, tears, cracks in the skin are more plausible, or are way more probable. and the pathogen for the HIV infection or for the disease is well known. That's why it's already called HIV infection. We know what it is, and this is what's going to save my ass. Semmelweis, I talked a lot about Semmelweis, who discovered that the cause of childbed fever, of a puerperal sepsis or septicemia of the mother, is actually the physician's, or used to be the physician's hand. Bacteria on the physician's hands caused childbed fever. But he didn't have this whole pathogen concept, this bacteria concept, and so he was quite tragic, because he didn't succeed in proving or in convincing others of his theory. He didn't have the concept of the pathogen, but he knew what the cause is. And Bradford Hill also clearly states that a biological mechanism is not an absolute criterion. Is not a sine qua non criterion. It's not a necessary criterion for causality. You don't have to know the actual mechanism. This is quite interesting from a philosophy of science point of view also, because even the mechanism will always be a thing that depends on observation and statistics itself. And so the mechanism is not too important. But I do have a mechanism here. The mechanism is plausible, so I also have that. This is what's going to save my ass. Semmelweis was a very tragic case, sadly. He didn't have that, know about the pathogen concept. And so people, dumb as they are, didn't believe him. How would that work? The hands, or this body, this cadaver, this dead body, poison? How should that work? They didn't understand. They didn't understand it. Analogy, another criterion. Yes, there are analogy effects here. For example, the infection dynamics or the transmission phenomena of the hepatitis C virus in men who have sex with men. Sometimes men who have sex with men, especially those who already have HIV, are infected with HCV, with the hepatitis C virus, in a sexual way or through sex, through anal intercourse. And we know for HCV, or it's clearer for HCV than for HIV, that blood contact is needed for HCV to be transmitted. And it is transmitted in anal intercourse or through fisting, multiple fisting partners where one hand goes from one anus to another anus. But it also might occur sometimes through anal intercourse alone, where one penis goes from one anus to another anus. Or when there are penile wounds and anal wounds, it's also possible, but this is rare. It's also possible in twosomes, in a way, from one partner to another partner. So there are also analogous effects. By the way, HCV is also quite prevalent in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I think that maybe the sexual route of transmission is underestimated there. People assume that most of it is due to iatrogenic transmission in Sub-Saharan Africa. There are some studies claiming that it's iatrogenic transmission, and it's not. For this, it's not really conspiracy theory. The theory by Gisselquist that HIV is mainly iatrogenic in Sub-Saharan Africa, that is something, or that has something of a conspiracy theory to it, because it's also highly implausible, because in the US, whereas blacks still are one of the main victim groups, or almost the greatest victim group now too for HIV, injections are safe, are usually quite safe in the US, and blacks still are disproportionately affected by HIV. So I don't think that iatrogenic effects do play a role, but there are serious studies claiming that HCV, the hepatitis C virus, is so common in Sub-Saharan Africa because of unsafe needle injections. But I think maybe the sexual route of transmission is underestimated, because after all, it could be the same route of transmission or the same factors of transmission for HIV in MSM and in Sub-Saharan Africa, and so why should there be different routes of transmission for the hepatitis C virus that gay men also get on the sexual way? Now, another criterion is the coherence, biological coherence, or what Bradford Hill actually means is, well, laboratory studies. He gives an example, at least, about laboratory studies, or he also talks about, well, there are no, it's biologically coherent. There are no other results in the realm of biology that contradict that hypothesis, or the view that the factor that is considered plays a causal role for an effect, or for a phenomenon that is considered. So, laboratory studies. There are some about humanized mice who were, or which were infected.
Let me correct that quickly. Who were infected? Because I'm a mammal too.
With HIV, anally and vaginally. And I discussed this in the HIV transmission in humanized mice video. I reviewed the studies that have been done about it, and it doesn't contradict my theory, because either people did not succeed in infecting humanized mice rectally, or they succeeded in infecting human mice rectally, but they used a Dremel tool, a grinding stone Dremel tool, in order to cause mild or even moderate abrasions in the anus in order to be able to infect the mouse. So abrasions, lacerations, a grinding stone was inserted into the anus and removed 15 times. This is what was needed for infecting the mouse. And there is some contradiction in one. There was some contradiction in one study where they succeeded in infecting humanized mice with HIV rectally and vaginally without causing epithelial abrasions, but this cannot possibly be a good model for HIV transmission in humans, because infection was equally probable vaginally or anally, or it was even more probable, it was easier vaginally than rectally, and so this cannot possibly be a good model for the human case. So laboratory studies also very much in line with my hypothesis. I also fulfill this Bradford Hill criterion. Another thing, experiment or semi-experimental evidence. This is what Bradford Hill also considers as a good hint for a causal role. And the results on infection dynamics in Kenyan sex workers, they can be considered at least as semi-experimental evidence here, in my case. Sometimes you can only consider semi-experimental evidence or quasi-experimental evidence. In astronomy, for example. In astronomy, an experiment is rarely, very rarely possible. Maybe you can throw a stone and say this is, well, some kind of meteor, or experiments are rarely possible due to our technical or technological possibilities, but some constellations or some movements of celestial bodies do have quasi or semi-experimental character. You can either corroborate or contradict or falsify a hypothesis when you look at a specific movement of a celestial body that you expect. So astronomical experiments are not possible due to technological limits, and experiments about HIV transmission with regard to vaginal caliber, they are limited by the prudishness of people, by this human sexuality taboo, the core taboo of sexuality, the actual act of copulating or of inserting the penis into an opening. And so here we also only have semi-experimental evidence, unless I can change that in the future. So the finding that some sex workers that have already been thought to be immune, or that had already been thought to be immune to the disease, the fact that they do seroconvert, that they do catch the virus, as soon as they take a holiday, they take a vacation, a holiday, or as soon as they stop sex work and then resume sex work or sexual activity again, and then they seroconvert, the fact that they do seroconvert after a longer abstinence from sex, that has quasi-experimental character. Because if my idea is true, this is what should have been expected. Because after this period of abstinence, this longer period of abstinence, the natural ethnicity-related narrowness was then re-established again. After this period of abstinence, it re-establishes, or it tightens, it narrows quite quickly again in this ethnic group. The vagina narrows quite quickly again. And so this absolutely has quasi-experimental character, and is an excellent proof, or is excellent evidence for my hypothesis. Also, in a self-experiment, I determined the interval in which the anus stays wide, and in which new tears, or in which small lacerations, do not occur. If dilation to the caliber of a penis occurs every 3 to 5, every 3 to 6, the maximum is 6 days, every 3 to 6 days. If dilation occurs every 3 to 6 days, then lacerations or microtrauma or minor bleeding won't occur. And this is what I determined through a self-experiment. This is the other point where experiment comes into my theory. And this also is very much in line with the other results, or with the other findings. There are 2 other criteria in Bradford Hill that I haven't discussed so far, and this is biological gradient, that is, or dose-response effect, or dose-response curve effects, meaning that the more you smoke, the more likely is it that you will develop lung cancer or other cancer. That is, if you increase one factor that you think is the cause, then you observe an increase in the supposed effect. And here I also absolutely fulfill that criterion, because the studies on the use of poppers, or on the use of lubricants, or the studies on anal bleeding and HIV risk, they indicate that the higher the stenosis, the anal stenosis, the higher the risk of HIV. Because if you have bleeding, then the stenosis is quite severe already, and a higher amount of bleeding was found to be correlated to a higher HIV infection rate. So I also have a dose-response curve that points to an imminent role of the factor of anogenital narrowness. And forward causality, there is no backwards causality in nature. There might be some, in some weird way, there might be some in quantum mechanics, but in the usual macroscopic world, there is no backwards causality. This is another criterion, so the supposed cause should occur before the effect. And I think this is can hardly be doubted in this case. Very rarely is there an HIV infection through sexual intercourse before you have sex. And also, quite interestingly, HIV is sometimes seen as a cause for a secondary anal fissure that is not due to primary tears. Sometimes it is claimed that HIV can itself lead to anal fissures, to chronic anal fissures. But we do know that HIV has some effects on the gut, on the digestive tract, but it might even be the case that it's the other way around here, that the phenomenon that some HIV positive men who have sex with men suffer from anal fissure might be due to the thing that actually gave them HIV. This is what has also been suspected in a recent book, a recent monograph on anal fissure, on chronic anal fissure, a whole monograph about anal fissure, quite a nice little book. They suspected that many chronic anal fissures in HIV positive men are due to traumatic anal intercourse. But why should that anal intercourse have been traumatic? Well, because they have some anal stenosis, which in the first place could have given them HIV, but maybe a secondary fissure due to HIV is also possible. So another thing that I wanted to talk about is I wanted to appeal to the conscience of the biomedical community that refuses to collaborate with me. And I thought about what could be the reasons that people refuse to talk to me. Why don't they collaborate with me and try to end this epidemic with me once and for all? It could be that they think that I'm simply a fool, that I'm a freak, that I'm a lunatic. And if this should be the reason, I can reply, well, you're absolutely right. I am a freak. I am a lunatic. I am quite sick, actually. But this does not play any role. This is wholly independent of the question whether or not my hypothesis is true. That plays no role at all. My personal mental health. It's about the scientific facts that matter. Now, some may think that I am some kind of AIDS denialist in disguise, but there is no reason for assuming that. I am of the opinion that HIV exists, that it causes AIDS, and that it cannot, contra Luc Montagnier, who now sadly has lost it, contra Luc Montagnier, I don't think that lemons or garlic or a proper nutrition will heal it. I am in no way an AIDS denialist. I don't adhere to any conspiracy theory around HIV. Actually, I really don't. I don't care a damn where it came from. I think the mainstream theory is true, that it is, or that it derives from the SIV, the simian immunodeficiency virus from monkeys, but actually I don't give a damn about where it comes from. I only give a damn about how to end the epidemic. I am of the opinion that most HIV infections are due to sexual transmission, and this is also where we can take action. We can prevent the sexual transmissions. After all, mother-to-child transmission can be prevented much more effectively, it seems, than sexual transmission. All I doubt is a few small details in transmission, and I think I have good reasons for this. I just discussed the Bradford Hill criteria that I excellently fulfill. I fulfill all the Bradford Hill criteria for causality, for a causal association. Now, what else could be the cause for this shyness to communicate with me? Could be that people think that my ideas contradict some evidence, some data. But then please tell me, give me this evidence, show me this evidence that contradicts my theory. I am rather prudish, neurotic and shy myself, and I'd also prefer that other reasons are responsible for this spread. But then please don't stop the discussion, don't end the discussion as soon as I do reply, or as soon as I raise some objections to this evidence, or as soon as I examine this evidence and find that it's not really evidence that contradicts my theory. Then also comment upon this, and don't just end the discussion. Because in the rare cases where people did reply to my emails, this was what they did. I still had some objections or some comments, and then they ended the discussion. Another reason might be that my theory has to do with sexual taboos. It's a very complicated theory in that sense. Indeed, I do admit that, but these taboos need to be broken. These taboos must be broken because they lead to people still dying in areas where HIV medication is not affordable, or where they don't have a good health insurance, or where the drugs don't work. In some people the drugs simply don't work. It's about human lives, actually. And even in places where medication is affordable and is working, or in people where it is working, it's not a curable disease. It's a very well manageable disease now, but it's not a curable disease, and the quality of life is deeply affected by it. As soon as you stop taking the medication, you know that in 5 to 10, in 10 to 20 years, or 10 to 15 years, you'll die. And now the doctor, the physician, is still not a friend or an ally as far as sexual matters are concerned. But still, the doctor is some kind of a conservative moral authority in view of many, in the subjective view of many patients. He is socially, just the social standing of a doctor is still some kind of an alpha male or of an alpha animal, where as the patient has some inner desire or some subconscious desire to act as a sexless being almost, in order not to be bitten by the alpha. And this is true for all types of doctors, for female doctors, for gay doctors. Gay doctors sometimes are more prudish than straight doctors, I think. But it's especially this is especially true also for heterosexual doctors, because after all, that women are not allowed to have fun, or that women that pleasure in women, that sexual pleasure used to be something that wasn't even talked about in women, or that was seen as almost absurd, or that it's the male pleasure that counts in sexuality. That women's sexuality actually is not really discussed very often. I'm a radical feminist. That's not new. So that women were deprived sexual pleasure or a sexual lust, or that women actually, or the view that even quite on the contrary and explicitly, that women need to suffer during sexual intercourse. This view is nothing new. We feminists just shrug our shoulders when we hear such views. But most HIV-infected men, HIV-positive men,
or even somewhat more importantly, gay men in proctology who are at risk of becoming HIV positive,
they are actually fellows. They are consexuals even. And still, their doctor cannot ask them if anal intercourse is pleasurable, if whether there are any complaints, whether there is pain, and whether you as their doctor can alleviate that pain, can make sex more enjoyable. They rather, in proctology or colorectal doctors rather ask about much more heartwarming and nice things as the consistency of the feces. That's a much better question to ask for them. They feel much more comfortable to ask that, to ask about shit. Yeah, what are your feces like? How does your shit look? Tell me. Tell your doctor. That they can ask, but is sex pleasurable? Is it pleasurable and comfortable when you receive the penis? That's way too disgusting to ask. And still, a reduction of promiscuity is sometimes seen as something desirable in HIV clinics, but it's probably completely irrelevant. It might quite probably only be the anal caliber that's important for the HIV spread. Number of partners or number of different partners might be completely irrelevant for this spread. People could simply be jealous, but in this case, shame on you. It's not about fame or merits. It's about human lives and the quality of life in medicine. And now, if I am correct, and if I should succeed in proving this theory without the help in my biomedical community, or rather despite this being left alone by my own colleagues, if I do succeed in proving it anyway, how do you in the biomedical community think will history of science or the public judge upon you all in the future? So I think there is absolutely no reason not to communicate with me, or not to start to collaborate with me in order to end this epidemic.